There are many moments for compassion and tender action. There are many moments for ruthless action. What is often called ruthless.
Since the beginning of time, early men killed each other for objects that shine. Now businessmen do it with progress in mind. It ain't all about streets, projects, and nines. This is crime, a very complex design. As long as motherfuckers got checks to sign, as long as they connects, got elects to shine. Find the money, all these cats got texts in mind. This is crime, ain't nobody new to it. Everybody been through it, shit. Even Martha Stewart do it. White collar, not a lot of time. Tell them what you got in mind. Stock tips to Glock clips. There's a whole lot of crime.
After that kind of introduction, it's blatantly obvious that the aftermath and consequences of armed violence are easy to visualize. Images of human suffering and misery are commonplace. However, defining armed violence is somewhat more problematic. The OECD defines armed violence as the use or threatened use of weaponry to bring about psychological or physical harm. We can also fall into the trap of thinking of armed violence as only affecting conflict-related zones. Conflict zones, places that have civil wars or wars in general. The reality is somewhat different. If we have a look at this diagram, we notice that the number of non-conflict deaths massively outweighs both direct and indirect conflict deaths. Between 2004 and 2007, at least 208,300 violent deaths were recorded in armed conflicts. An average of 52,000 people were killed each year. In contrast though, non-conflict armed violence accounted for a much higher number of deaths per year, and this is a genuine burden on humanity. The world average homicide rate in 2004 was 7.6 per 100,000 of the population, and the majority of these, over 60% of violent deaths, are committed with firearms. This presentation aims to look at two distinct case studies. The first will look at conflict armed violence scenario. Typically, we'll be looking at Liberia. The second case study will look at non-conflict armed violence, and we'll be looking at the country of El Salvador.
Liberia, or the Republic of Liberia, is located in Western Africa. It shares borders with Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Ivory Coast. Liberia's population is about 3.7 million, and its capital is Monrovia. The country was stable until President William Tolbert was overthrown and executed in 1980 by Sergeant Samuel Doe. This coup d'etat took place after a food price riot. Within a 14-year period, Liberia endured 2 consecutive wars in what has been called a descent into anarchy. The first war, known in Liberia as the Terror War, started in 1989. During this war, the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, an armed group led by the US Liberian Charles Taylor, removed the regime of President Samuel Doe. It ended with a peace agreement signed in 1996 that was followed by the election of Taylor as president 1 year later. Consequently, Liberia witnessed a first attempt of implementing a DDR program between 1996 and 1997. The first attempt was considered to be a failure, as the ex-combatants that were disarmed and demobilized were never reintegrated, as donors became tired supporting the DDR program. The Second War began in 1989 when a group of insurgents of the Liberian United for Reconciliation and Democracy, known as LURD, infiltrated Lofa County from Guinea. Another group of insurgents, the Movement for Democracy in Liberia, MODEL, subsequently attacked the Taylor government, entering the eastern part of the country from neighboring Côte d'Ivoire in early 2003. The two civil wars claimed an estimated 250,000 lives, decimating the pre-war population of roughly 3 million people, and displaced as many as 1.5 million people, including 700,000 refugees who fled to another country. Widespread collective violence in Liberia finally came to a halt with the Comprehensive Peace Agreement that was signed in Accra in August 2003. With President Taylor in the exile, the National Transitional Government of Liberia was established to ease the shift from war to peace. Popular elections, largely deemed free and fair, were held in late 2005 and brought to power Africa's first female head of state, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Together with the largest UN peacekeeping mission in the world, UNMIL, the government of Liberia has made much progress on the path to peace and democracy. Indeed, the UNMIL mandate included the development and implementation of a DDR strategy for ex-combatants. Before going any further, let's consider what is DDR. DDR is a three-step program designed to take the guns away and provide opportunities for those involved in the war. DDR stands for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. Its main goal is to create a secure and stable environment in countries emerging from conflict in order to rebuild and restore development. The DDR process supports ex-combatants to participate actively into the peace process by removing weapons from combatants, taking the combatants out of the military structures and helping them to integrate socially and economically into society. It is important to understand that DDR in itself cannot resolve conflict or prevent violence to occur. However, DDR can contribute to security and stability in post-conflict settings so that other elements of a recovery and peace-building strategy can proceed.
DDR was first tried out in Liberia in the late 1990s after the signing of the first peace agreements between Charles Taylor and the various fighting factions. Now, this has been perceived to be a failure, mainly down to the renewed Second Civil War, which took part between the same parties who signed the first peace agreement. However, if we look at the process that took part and the dynamics behind it, we hypothesize that regardless of the fighting, the process would have failed anyway. And we cite the following reasons. First of all, the DDR centers were manned by ECOMOG troops. Now, despite them being neutral African peacekeepers, there was a misunderstanding of their role. They were seen to be an apparatus of Charles Taylor. They were seen as an extension of the government. Rebel factions had the perception that they had been fighting these people for such a long time, and handing over their weaponry to them made them vulnerable, susceptible to attack. The second point follows on quite nicely from the first, that there was a misinformation about the whole process. DDR in Liberia relied heavily on the submission of personal sensitive data over to the DDR centers, including what your name was, which faction you were part of, and where you were stationed. There was a worry that you would be persecuted, prosecuted, and punished for handing this over and for taking part in the conflict, leading people to further not engage with the process. The third point was donor fatigue. Even at that point, questions were being raised about the effectiveness of the process, and donors were starting to reallocate funds to other causes and other measures. The fourth point was, in any DDR process, there is an element of corruption. In Liberia, it was no different. There were reports of ex-combatants gathering weaponry that didn't belong to them just to claim back some compensation from the DDR centers. Now, probably one of the most damning statistics about the DDR process, first taken up in the late 1990s, was that the key hallmark of the Liberian conflict was the use of child combatants by both the government and the rebel factions. It is estimated that over 20,000 took part in the conflict. However, only 4,000 took part in the DDR process itself. When we analyzed this, we found that child combatants, by statements they had made, had the same fears as their adult counterparts, but with the added fear that if they registered with the DDR process, they would later be deployed back into the front lines. After the signing of the peace agreement, or the comprehensive peace agreement between Charles Taylor and the fighting factions, for the second time, the UN mission to Liberia was established, and one of the terms of reference was to take part and to administer a DDR process. Now, this has been seen to be a wide success. There was a return of refugees and IDPs. Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created. Security services were restructured, and there was a flourishing of media and journalism. Now, there was a little bit of a disparity in the DDR process and the expectations. Whilst there was an expected number of participants between 38,000 to 45,000, the actual number was 103,019 ex-combatants participating in the DDR process. Now, the weapons collected far outweighed the original estimates. 27,000 weapons were collected, 6.1 million ammunition, and 29,794 unexploded ordnances were also taken up. Now, this is down to the lowering, or the numbers of people participating is down to the lowering of the original entry requirement for the DDR process, which started out as a single firearm and then descended into providing just under 200 ammunitions. Now, once a gun or ammunition had been provided to the DDR centers, the combatant was entitled to a transitional safety allowance, or TSA, which was $300 provided in 2 installments. The reintegration rehabilitation of ex-combatants had 3 different routes: formal education, vocational training, and apprenticeship skills.
When you look at the engendering the process, especially the DD, we did not have the appearance of an engendered process. And this led to not many women understanding to come forth. And even if they came forth, the process was designed for males.
We have many women fighting here, especially in Lofa here. It was difficult for women ready to be disarmed. Once you don't have somebody, or you are not found with one of these generals, you will never get guns to disarm.
The second DDR process in Liberia had a massive positive impact in terms of child soldiers. The overall process was seen by UNICEF, and they took a very interesting approach to the whole DDR process in terms of children. Now, children were still disarmed alongside their adult combatants, their adult compatriots, in disarmament centers. However, since that point, UNICEF subcontracted out what they called child protection agencies, or CPAs, including organizations like Save the Children, who had a mass of expertise around dealing and treating with children who'd been through traumatic experiences. And these were called interim care centers, or ICCs. The ICCs operated on a philosophy of the devil makes work for idle hands, and children were engaged in a 12-hour daily routine that kept them focused and that kept them engaged in a positive and constructive process. This was particularly useful with children who had sadly developed an addiction to drugs, and they were kept so busy that they didn't even have time to think how they would get hold of their next fix. Now, children who attended these centers were given specialist medical and psychological support to help them come to terms with what they had been through and to slowly overcome it. They were given excellent nutrition and dietary support to ensure that if they were malnourished or they had a food disorder, they were able to overcome it and were given healthy food. All children were expected to attend primary education and also to engage in prayer activities in the mornings. And if possible, a film showing was also provided in the evening. But most surprising of all was the role of football in this, where children from warring factions found themselves on similar teams or on the same team, and questions about which faction you'd been part of in the war became relevant, and the position of your team and how your team was playing became the talk of the day. And not being able to play in the day's match became such a punishment that children stuck to the camp rules as much as possible. The reintegration process had a 90% success rate of reuniting children with their parents and communities. Now, this was done purely down to the ingenious process created by the CPAs, where they used what they deemed or what they called child welfare committees. These child welfare committees consisted of the key stakeholders in that child's life: the parents, community elders, representatives from the Child Protection Agency, and an imam or priest or religious leader from the community itself. And the CPA explained what the child had been through, why they committed what they committed, and the journey the child had been on. And in 90% of the time, children were welcomed back into the community. Sadly, 10% of the time this didn't happen and children went to foster care, or if they were deemed old enough, they were provided support to go into independent living. Now, after reintegration into the community, they were offered two distinct paths. The first one offered children the opportunity to take part in vocational-based learning, where they were, and this differed between CPA to CPA. Now, the process effectively consisted of the child taking part in a course based at a center, and depending on which community they lived in or were going to live in, they were advised on where the best business for them would be and the best sustainable future would be, whether this would be, for example, baking or carpentry or being an electrician. After their initial training period, the best artisans in the community were seeked out, and they were offered a brand new equipment or a monthly stipend in exchange for training the student for 9 months. After the student graduated or completed the program, they were offered a toolkit to get them started and to provide them with everything they needed to start their own business, and they were even given, in some instances, a loan to help with startup costs. The second option was to go into education, and some ex-child students pursued primary, secondary, and tertiary education. And schools were encouraged to take ex-child combatants by being provided with resource, books, and even funding that all children could benefit from, taking away that stigma of being a child soldier in a local community. Now, with any program, there are always going to be issues, and the DDR program was no different, and there were two distinct problems that arose. The first of them was in instances where a child had received a £300 TSA allowance. Now, this $300 TSA allowance had arisen some grievances in the community, where $300 is equivalent to almost 2 years' annual salary for a worker in Liberia. And to see children with this amount of money, it was seen as to have rewarded them for the atrocities they had committed. The second issue was the $30 training allowance that was given to older combatants who were deemed to be adults and weren't given to child soldiers, because it was seen to have upset the dynamic of traditional Liberian life, where children all of a sudden were the breadwinners for a family, and this was seen as unacceptable, and this caused a load of grievance between children and the community and the care providers, and even in some cases the artisan. There were even reports of the toolkits being provided late, which in some cases even saw children and ex-combatants resort to violence.
We will now consider armed violence reduction programs in a non-conflict setting, namely in El Salvador.
El Salvador, capital city San Salvador, with a population of 6.2 million. It lies next to Guatemala and Honduras, and it borders the Pacific Ocean. El Salvador witnessed 12 years of civil war between military junta and left-wing guerrilla groups, leaving 70,000 people dead and more than $2 billion worth of damage. As a result of the war, there was a high rate of poverty, violence, and lack of opportunities, which made El Salvador a fertile ground to street gangs, known as the Maras. As President Saka had mentioned, gangs are a regional problem that required a regional solution due to the high number of armed violence that had been taking place by the gangs. Gangs. According to Small Arms Survey in 2009, most prominent aspect of the new landscape of Central America is the phenomenon of gang violence. The two most powerful gangs in El Salvador are the La Mara Salvatrucha and the 18th Street, both formed in Los Angeles. Members who were deported to El Salvador faced poor reinsertion opportunities and so implemented the gang's logic, integrating local teenagers. With 15% of youth within gang communities can reportedly end up joining a gang. With time, these gangs came to the use of higher and higher level of violence with military-style weapons such as AK-47s, handmade weapons, explosive fragmentation, grenades, Uzis, automatic pistols, and sophisticated weapons. Many of these arms were either smuggled from the US or have been stolen from the local government.
Mano Dura, a plan that was created in 2003 aimed to dismantle gangs, reduce violence and homicide rate. It expanded the powers of the army and allowed the police to arrest and imprison people regarding their physical appearance. As a result, human rights activists and judges found it as an act of human rights violation. After the Supreme Court declared Mano Dura unconstitutional, the government tried to take in count the critics and launched Plan Mano Superdura. Rather than rehabilitating and giving gang members opportunities, the police forces imprisoned 17,000 gang members, which led to an increase of violence, not only in the street but also in the prison of San Salvador.
In spite of the disarmament of ex-combatants by 1992 peace accord, one of the surveys shows that there are about 400,000 firearms among civilians. In other words, there are 2 firearms for every 10 adults in El Salvador. Along with the inadequate gun registration system, ill-equipped National Civil Police failed to prevent civilians from the wave of armed violence and crimes. In addition, the number of gun-related homicide is about 2/3 of all homicide. In this part, we are going to describe UN-led armed violence prevention programs, which aim to reinforce security institutions and effective arms control. In Phase 1 of Armed Violence Prevention Program, 2 UN agencies, UNDP and WHO, conducted Arms-Free Municipalities project in San Martin and Ilopango in San Salvador metropolitan area from 2005 to 2006.
The Phase 1 program had 6 key goals. The first was municipal level laws restricting the carrying of arms in all public places. There was an increase in the policing capacity to enforce this prohibition. Mass publicity campaign on the dangers of firearms and the new regulation on carrying weapons. Analysis of the overall experience in order to inform legislative debates and serve as a model for other municipalities. Evaluate research on the impact of the project components. And a firearm amnesty to encourage people to surrender any arms that they had.
At the end of Phase 1, the project achieved remarkable results. Lethal violence decreased by 49%, crimes concerning firearms decreased by 24%. The number of firearms correction by PNC increased by 69% to 102%. In following Phase 2 of Armed Violence Prevention Program from 2009 to 2011, 6 UN agencies, UNDP, WHO, UNICEF, UN Habitat, UNDOC and UNODA employed a joint program for violence prevention in San Salvador.
Another program that one should look at is the Youth Soccer League, which is a strategy for gang and crime prevention. In 2006, a violence prevention program has been implemented by a local government in San Martin outside San Salvador. The soccer league consists of 7 levels for youth ages 6 to 18 and one elite team aged from 18 to 26. The teams compete against with 8 other municipalities in Department of San Salvador. One might wonder, why would it work? According to the OECD, evidence show that youth are the witness and victims of violence at family and community levels during armed conflicts, that can regard violence as an acceptable means to resolve problems, and as a result, that would increase in the likelihood of them being the future perpetrators. In order to avoid youth viewing weapons as a source of protection and status, there must be a strong community-based program that would serve as a protective factor that would prevent the youth to enter any sort of violence, because the communities can generate activities for youth that would offer them opportunities, make them self-confident, and contribute to their community. It will also aid in the youth resilience by giving them a sense of identity and belonging.
Number of conclusions in regards to the 2 case studies we've looked at today. Now, the first one being that any type of AVR campaign or policy needs to have sufficient financial planning and a financial structure built into the program that ensures each of its components are sufficiently well funded, with a contingency that means that if a certain element of a program is overburdened, it doesn't collapse any other elements of the program. The DDR campaign in Liberia over-prioritized the disarmament parts of the DDR triangle, and down to this, and because of this decision, women ended up being inadvertently excluded from the reintegration part of the process. The second conclusion we can make is that the way in which an AVR campaign is marketed to a certain extent, communicated, and its information disseminated is also essential to its success, ensuring that the target participants in any type of AVR campaign understand how the AVR campaign works, why certain information is required, and what's going to happen to that information is essential into getting the buy-in or the local buy-in that is needed to ensure any AVR campaign works. Thirdly, we need to ensure that any AVR program or campaign or policy is what we've called a living, breathing document, that it is constantly in check, constantly reviewed, and that data, in real-time data from the program, is being observed and the program is restructured accordingly. The Manodura program in El Salvador could have really done with this kind of idea. The fact that as a direct consequence of the program, the prison system became overran, and far from becoming a reforming institution, it became a reinforcing institution, where we had members of gangs being segregated into different cell blocks, further reinforcing that gang mentality. And finally, the role of youth must not be underestimated, and youth engagement in AVR campaigns. Now, if we look at the incredible turnaround and the incredible difference a simple football league in El Salvador made to potential gang members, and a simple football game made to the lives of child soldiers in Liberia, we can see that youth engagement is essential to ensuring that AVR is conducted properly and has a positive effect.
As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life and realize there's nothing left. Cause I've been blasting and laughing so long that even my mama thinks that my mind is gone. But I ain't never crossed a man that didn't deserve it. Me be treated like a punk, you know that's unheard of. You better watch how you're talking and where you're walking, or you and your homies might be lying in chalk. I really hate the trip, but I gotta low. As they croak, I see myself in the pistol smoke. Fool, I'm the kind of G the little homies wanna be like, on my knees in the night, saying prayers in the street light. Been spending most of the night living in the gangster's paradise. Been spending most of the night living in the gangster's paradise. Keep spending most of the night living in the gangster's paradise. Keep spending most of the night living in the gangster's paradise. Look at the situation they got me facing. I can't live a normal life. I was raised by the state, so I gotta be down with the hood team. Too much television watching got me chasing dreams. I'm an educated fool with money on my mind. Got my tin in my hand and a gleam in my eye. I'm a loped out gangster, set tripping banker, and my homies is down, so don't arouse my anger. Fool, death ain't nothing but a heartbeat away. I'm living life, do or die. What can I say? I'm 23 now, but will I live to see 24? The way things is going, I don't know. Tell me why are we so blind to see that the ones we hurt are you and me?
Alright guys, smile, it's the making of the head of a project.
The project. The project. Okay, this can never ever make it off this computer after delete. I think my head does not match my body. I have a big head.
This is already past midnight. Let's see the feeling of the group. So guys, how are you now? Nora?
Tired.
Yeah, Yuta?
Bad.
Sorry?
Bad.
No, come on. Positive vibration. Listen to you.
There's no positivity here. The sun is gone. The happiness went.
Oh,
I want to go to sleep.
realistic
Who
image
the
back.
hell thought about doing a video? This is a bad idea.
Machiman?
We will make it, you know, it's gonna be magical.
Oh, good one.